It's a great moment for the Humanities Center to have Sari Nusseibeh here, and for me personally, such a lovely satisfaction to have Sari and his family. They'd spent a year here in 2008, is it? 2008? No, sorry, 2004, 2005. And before that, I'd invited Sari on an occasion with Avishai Margalit for the three of us to have a conversation about, guess what? The situation hasn't been solved since, but we had a very good conversation, and I particularly timed it on a Wednesday morning because it was on that day, several years before, that Sari and Avishai used to meet at the Christchurch Coffee House, if I remember, to talk about Middle Eastern politics. So we decided to time it, do it at the same time, of course, with the time difference, and we had a really excellent conversation on some of the underlying issues that have informed this long struggle. Sari Nusseibeh is Professor of Islamic and Political Philosophy at Al-Quds University, East Jerusalem, where he served as president from 1995 to 2014. He taught at Bezait University in the West Bank from 78 till 91, when he was placed under administrative detention in an Israeli jail for 3 months. He has founded and chaired several grassroots committees, unions and NGOs, including in 2002, the People's Voice, a binational public campaign for a two-state solution. His latest books include Once Upon a Country, A Palestinian Life, What is a Palestinian State Worth?, The Story of Reason in Islam, and most recently, Avicenna's Al-Shifa. He was the Rita Hauser Fellow at Radcliffe in 2004 and 5, and gave the Tanner Lectures at Harvard in 2008. This is only one occasion, or one event during which Sari will be speaking. Peter, can you give me the other event where Sari will be speaking?
The other event is this Thursday.
This Thursday.
Sorry, forgive me, you'll know the full title. I can look it up.
Please, if you would at the end, and just... Still to be arranged. TBA. To the study of political philosophy and social ethics, Sari brings a remarkable blend of scholarly insight and pragmatic, strategic intelligence. The depth of his learning in medieval and modern Islamic philosophy is only matched by the range of his expertise in traditions of Western liberal thought and ethical theory. Sari's personal and professional involvement with many significant Israeli-Palestinian peace initiatives gives his view a rare authority. While being fully aware of the importance of pragmatic and strategic maneuvers, Sari conceives of the process of negotiation as an ethical practice that must be fully committed to the mutuality and dignity of the antagonist. And it is from Sari that I've learned very important issues about the ethics of negotiation, sometimes deployed in meetings, at other times just conceptually speculative. The idea, I remember once in a conversation, that once you get into the chamber to negotiate, you have a chance of making your opponent. You know, your opponent only doesn't come to you as given. And then the other concept that I remember is I won't get the words for it, is that one of the most interesting ways of actually riding past the obstacles that people bring with them is to put a kind of idea or a goal outside of the immediate negotiation. So people always have a horizon to work towards, and that gives a different sense of scale to where you're going and what you're speaking and what gains you want. So I like this, this idea, which is both partly a distraction and a horizon. Interesting strategy. Negotiation for Sari is a noble calling. He insists on the necessity, however remote or aspirational it may appear, of open dialogue, in which the commitment to the Palestinian cause does not prevent him from seeing how aims, goals, and even values come to be transformed in the processes of negotiation. Even in the darkest times, Sari surpassed his dogmas and orthodoxies to suggest that in order to reach a workable agreement, there has to be an ethical commitment to the very process of negotiation. The title of this evening's conversation comes from the question Sari posed in a talk he gave in Jerusalem last December. What he asked, would sharing a city mean? Sari, welcome, and thank you so much for coming here and being in conversation once again.
Thank you. Thank you, Homi.
You can speak sitting, you can speak standing, you can do whatever. After you speak, I forgot to say, we have 3 photographs from Michal Safdie's new book on Jerusalem, which we will show after Sari's conversation, and just use them as part of our conversation, and indeed yours. She's unable to be with us today, but I'm extremely grateful to Michal Safdie for allowing us to use her photographs.
Well, I'm very grateful too. If I sat, will you hear me? I mean, will it sort of be impolite if I sat? Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Homi for hosting me tonight. He has a very busy schedule, and he only arrived yesterday, I think, and is traveling away again tomorrow.
Pleasure to be.
And it just happened that he managed this particular meeting. And Homi was at the Radcliffe Institute the year I spent there, and so we had a wonderful time together, together with other colleagues actually, and it was a memorable year for me. Some other sort of colleagues are here present. I think Melissa was here somewhere. I can't see her, but there she is. That's Melissa. And it was a wonderful combination of people sort of doing physics and doing this and that. And so it was a wonderful year for me. And Homi, by the way, is also an excellent cook. So is Melissa, by the way. So I was asked to say something about Jerusalem, and in particular about the idea of sharing. And I haven't really prepared anything, but I want to sort of, speak less than 20 minutes, Homi, if you allow me.
Whatever you like.
And then I can take questions and perhaps address them. Maybe I just want to start off by saying that today there were municipal elections and local elections in Jerusalem and in Israel, in fact. And just like every other year for the past 50 years, I think, ever since 1967, only a tiny portion of the Palestinians, in fact, participated in those elections. I think less than 1%. Although this year there was an attempt by a group of Palestinians from Jerusalem to participate in those elections. But we can discuss this. Why is it that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem have, for all this time, been opposed to participating in the elections? And what does this mean in the context of thinking about sharing the city? As you know, there are perhaps between 300 and 400, or perhaps a bit over, Palestinians in Jerusalem. And they have actually been living since 1967 in a very strange kind of suspended situation, because they're not regarded, East Jerusalem is not regarded by Israel as occupied as the other territories. And it's annexed, so it falls under Israeli law. And the Palestinians, therefore, are residents in Israel insofar as they are Jerusalemites. but they have not, in the past 50 years, been involved. They haven't themselves accepted to become involved in any of the, as a community, in the municipal elections or in any other sort of institution in the Israeli system. Nonetheless, of course, they have been also seeking to find, together with their Palestinian colleagues, people in the rest of the West Bank and Gaza, trying to find a national solution, not a municipal solution, to the problem in the context of a two-state solution. And they've been involved in the negotiations along with other Palestinians in the context of that attempt to reach a two-state solution. And unfortunately, as you probably all know, that process has not really borne any fruit so far. And if anything, in fact, it looks like, looked at objectively, rationally speaking, it looks like it's been a failure. And that day after day, year after year, we're being pushed, I think both sides, maybe by default, into a single system, but not a system in which the two parties are partners, but it is a system in which one party is basically sitting on top of the other party. And in Jerusalem in particular, there have been problems that in a sense exemplify this very odd situation. The problems have been the slow, if you like, displacement of Palestinians in the city. Displacement not only as individuals, but also as a culture, as street names, as properties. In the past few weeks, there have been various attempts, successful attempts, to take over some Arab properties in the old city, buying Arab properties in the old city. And this has created a lot of noise among Jerusalemites, among Arab Jerusalemites, as a way of expressing anxiety about their status in the city. In other words, we're living in a situation that doesn't really give us much chance on the Palestinian side to think in terms of an equitable engagement with the other side. Now, this morning, I was asking my son, my eldest son, I was telling him I was going to talk about sharing, and what should I say about that? And he said, well, there are three ways of looking at sharing. One is, you divide things up. You have an orange, and you divide it up in the middle, and you sort of give one part to the one side and the other to the other. And the other way of doing it is to peel it, and then maybe the other party will take the either the orange or the or the peel, and that has to do with that has to do with what your needs are or concerns are. So one party may just need the peel, so you give it to them, and the other party needs the actual orange. But the third way, he said, was to think of it or of sharing as an idea. And I told him, what does that mean? And he said, well, in sharing an idea, there is no giving things away to somebody else. You maintain possession, if you like, you and the other, of the thing that you have before you. And he said to me, well, Jerusalem can be like that. Jerusalem can be an idea. And I thought about this on the train today to see whether I can agree with him, and decided I can't, because I thought, well, even as an idea, different parties actually can disagree over what the idea is. And we end up, in fact, needing to, once again, having to come to terms with one another. Let me go back to the beginning and to talk a little bit about the word sharing. When I first started talking or thinking about sharing, it was on the basis of listening to my sons and daughters, no, sons, my daughter not yet, but my sons telling their kids when they started fighting with one another over a piece of chocolate or a cake or something. And I tell them, I'd hear them tell their kids, you should share with your brother or your sister. And I started thinking about that, what that means, and decided really what that means at the end of the day is that you should be able to somehow respect the other, your brother in this case or sister, as an equal individual being. And when I started trying to think about how to apply this to Jerusalem, I started thinking, well, you can't really do any sharing between Israelis and Palestinians until and unless we somehow come to see each other as equal human beings. Now, at some points in the past 50 years, Homi just mentioned, for instance, my long-standing relationship with Avishai and many other examples. At some points, I could see that, in fact, Israelis and Palestinians could, in fact, look upon each other as equals and respect each other, and therefore would be prepared to share with the other, whatever needs to be shared between them. But at other points, and unfortunately more and more in the past few years, the demography of the Palestinians and of the Israelis has changed to such an extent that it's become far harder on our side to look at the other party as people with whom we can share, and for the other side to look upon us as a party with whom they can share. Of course, it's far more difficult if you're thinking of the sharing when it's being done between parties than when it's being done between individuals. Individuals can get along with one another far more easily. But when you're thinking of the claimants to Jerusalem, Israelis and Palestinians, and when you think of the way that both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, have actually transformed over the past few years, transformed to the worse, transformed in a way that makes each side begin to think more specifically of themselves and to exclude the other. It sort of has become really a very hard business to try and see how sharing can be done. I still hope that the miracle will occur. I always hope that the miracle will occur. After all, this is the Holy Land, and one should never lose hope, and I'm sure something will occur. But if you look at things objectively, rationally, unfortunately, I see that the situation has been deteriorating over the past few years, over the past 10, 15 years. And I see that it's going to be much harder to try and do something about it. Now, recently, all heard, I don't know how Trump sounds here. How does he sound here, Trump? Okay. But, I'm mentioning him because, referring to what Homi said just now, that sometimes you have to try and see beyond the immediate parameters. And what's been happening over the past year with us is that the United States policy, if you like, Trump policy, has been trying to make us back home to see beyond the existing parameters that we've actually been living with for the past 15 years of negotiations. Hi, Drew. How are you?
I'm sorry, I'm late.
I understand it's affirmative action somewhere. So that's the kind of thing that might...
How is Trump making you see beyond the parameters?
He sees.
No, but what about how you, when you hear about...
Okay, that's good. Thank you for asking me. So I'm better when I'm asked questions. So please ask questions. Now, of course, we on the Palestinian side are really very angry with Trump because we've been sort of led to believe over the past 10 to 20 years through the Oslo process and before that, that we'll end up basically having a state along the 67 lines, East Jerusalem as its capital. The refugee problem will be resolved in the context of the Palestinian state. In general, that was and this has failed. Now, Trump came along or comes along and says, forget about that. Maybe you can think about two states, but look at the wider region, look at the world around you, and think about how, you know, this part of the geography of the map can be linked up with that, how people from here can be sort of linked up with people from there. And it sort of makes one think of a future beyond, or a geography, if you like, or a political area beyond the sort of classical two-state solution or paradigm that we've been thinking of. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing. And indeed, I mean, we look upon it as a terrible thing as Palestinians. But I'm saying that maybe one does have to look beyond existing parameters. I mean, you know, at one point, I don't know if you realize this or not, but what today, for most of us, for a lot of us, seems to be a very sort of classical solution and rational solution, which is a two-state solution, at one point, believe it or not, was totally crazy. It wasn't accepted at all. It took many years, after 67 in particular, it took many years until the Americans came on board, the Europeans came on board, everybody came on board for a two-state solution. And it was a lot of hard work to get everybody to accept a two-state solution. So now to think or to propose that a two-state classical solution isn't necessarily going to work, but other things might work. You know,
so can you just tell us a little more about the Trump proposals? What are the geo-territorial ideas? I mean, what will happen?
I don't really know anything about, I mean, you know, the Trump proposals, but what I gather is that he's trying to bring in the rest of the Arab world. And he is basically trying to go along with an Israeli also policy of trying to what they call normalize relationships between Israel and the Arab world as a prelude or as a condition for going ahead with developing, giving more leeway for the Palestinians. Now, I don't know how far they want to go in terms of giving a leeway. I don't know how far Trump has in mind or anybody has in mind for the Palestinians. Do they want us to have a state or not, properly speaking? But I think they're trying to think of the entire region, so to speak. They have many ideas of linking up the region. For instance, the Minister of Transport in Israel apparently has very daring ideas about railway tracks that will bring everybody together. There was a visit recently of Netanyahu to Muscat, in which the Sultan of Oman was basically welcoming this kind of new world order, if you like, or regional order. Now, I don't know where we will end up as Palestinians. Maybe we will
diaspora.
Yes, it's possible in the diaspora, but also it's possible that we will end up in a single system with Israelis. In other words, by default again, in one state. Now, I'm not sure whether immediately people will be able to achieve full rights in such a state. Certainly, it doesn't look like this way for now. But eventually, maybe that's what will happen. I mean, if you look ahead, not 10 or 20 or 30 years, but further ahead, maybe that's what will happen. Maybe that's the only thing that can happen to get the Israelis and the Palestinians somehow, who are living in that area, to in fact share the entire political system. A lot has to be transformed in the psychologies and attitudes and creeds and beliefs of the people, the Palestinians and the Israelis. But maybe that's the only way to go forward.
So, have you finished? Do you want me to ask you questions? How do you want to play this?
I think I should stop myself
Okay.
from talking.
Well, let me ask you this then. Well, two things. One, if you look back 40 years, and you now look at the situation now, think of what you had, the hopes you'd had, the plans you'd had for the region, and now think of where you are. How do you feel about it?
In one word, very sad. I think it's very sad because I think that we've been paying a high price, both Israelis and Palestinians, certainly Palestinians. And to my mind, we've been paying a price that we needn't have paid in some way or another. I think that maybe we, in some mysterious way, we need to have paid it, but when you look at it rationally, you don't think that it was necessary. Look, I mean, I started out many years ago. The first time I actually accepted a two-state solution was, believe it or not, when I was a student here at Harvard. And someone came, Professor Walid Khalidi, came to visit, and he gave us a talk, the Palestinian Arab student community here, about a two-state solution. And I remember feeling very angry with that, because at the time, my idea was that why should there be two states? Can't we all live in one state? And can't we all have equal rights, and so on and so forth? But then slowly, that was in, when was it? In 74 maybe, or thereabouts, or 75. And then I went back home, I started teaching at Birzeit, and I started learning from the students I was teaching about their real needs, as opposed to the ideas that I had in my head. And I started seeing that the students' real needs had to do with two basic needs, which were freedom and independence, to be independent and to be free, that's to say, to have their own state. And therefore, I went along, basically, with the idea of two states on the basis that the student I was teaching wanted a state of their own and were prepared to have a two-state solution alongside Israel. And that developed, and so I worked very hard in order to try and bring that about. And as you know, I was part of or involved in whether second track or indirect negotiations with Israelis for many, many years, trying to bring that solution about, a two-state solution. But unfortunately, for different reasons, this hasn't come about, and I feel sad about this. And I feel that in many ways, maybe I was naive at the time to think that a two-state solution is indeed possible. And although I reject in my head thinking about things being inevitable and so on, but I've begun to think recently that maybe the idea of Zionism is not something that in fact works. It isn't something that can coexist with another party, with the Palestinians. It was at one point. It could have existed maybe at one point. But I think there have been transformations taking place within Zionism, within the state ideology of Israel. As indeed also, unfortunately, there have been also transformations on the Palestinian side, with people with the ideology on both sides becoming more or less inclusive, less accepting of the other. So yeah, in one state I feel sad, one word.
We had David Grossman. I had invited David Grossman here, and he gave a very affecting and beautiful lecture. And his view was very pessimistic, but he said that we live in these different bubbles there. I think he was very honest about it. We may share a whole lot of things. He said, within the bubble in which I live, I can say whatever I feel like about the Zionist Israeli nation state. And he was he is very critical of it. But when you talk, and even he talked about, the both sides, and we talk about the question of sharing. We talked about the analogy of your children, that, you or your son. So, what does it mean to share an idea or to share an orange, or children, please share a cake. And as you said, there's a sense of equality there. You wouldn't say that because you're a woman or you're a girl, you should have a smaller slice of cake. But how are these two sides disposed? Can we talk about sharing as if people come to the table in the same way? What's the point of that? Do they really come in the same way, or are there profound structural differences? If somebody comes to the table hungry, really hungry, they would see it as a right to take 3/4 of the cake. The question of sharing then is not some, ideal order. It is a sense of need. It is a sense of psychic desire, from trauma. So should we be talking about this with all this negotiatory balance as two sides? Or are we evading something?
If I understand you, I'm not sure, but I think that there are two ways of looking at this orange. In this case, looking at Jerusalem. One way, and that has been the classical approach, is to say, Jerusalem has Palestinians, has Israelis. A best way to approach the problem of the conflict between them, the conflicting claims between them, is simply to divide it up. Not share, but to divide it up. Divide it up between one side, which is then run entirely by the Palestinians, and the other by the Israelis. And this is the classical approach. So here you're dividing, you're not sharing, in a sense. And it's much easier, much simpler. It's sort of taking the orange in the middle, or at some point, and cutting it in half and saying, okay, you can do with your piece what you want, and I'll do with what I want. But this has become more and more difficult to do. The actual geographic division. And so now people sometimes say, well, maybe we can have a shared capital. So it's not a capital that can be divided up geographically, but it can be shared. Now, but the question is, how can this be shared? There has to be, as you said earlier, for a proper sharing, some kind of equitable recognition of the one by the other. Now, by recognition, what do I mean? I mean respect for their creed, for their religion, for their culture, for their national memory, for their narrative, for all kinds of things, which it's very hard to do now for the moment, which it's actually becoming harder and harder to do. But that's the only kind of sharing. Now, it's possible to share, for instance, services in a city, even if it's somehow, with a kind of porous, open border. You can share services, you can share a lot of public services, most of them perhaps, you can share lots of things, and still maintain some kind of equitable geographic balance, demographic balance on one side and the other. Things are possible, but I'm not sure that people are up to now talking about this or reaching solutions about it.
When we talk about sharing, there's also a sense of, some kind of sense of openness of the object. Now, without talking about the Palestinians or the Israelis for a minute, there is the whole security apparatus is such that the question of, exchange or passing is so difficult, with the barriers, the surveillance, the wall that skirts, that divides people's lands, the settlements that are a continual imperial outrage, and so it seems to me that, Sari, I applaud your sense that maybe in 40 years from now, or half of something will happen. But from everything you
Something
have
good.
said, something good will happen, but from everything you've said of the past 40 years, and indeed the trough now, it seems, it seems very difficult to imagine. So what is this dream of progress? Of course, one has to live that dream, but what, are there small instances of, you know, of the local state or local, or local initiatives that would give us hope? Because what you've just said about today's election, where less than 1% of Palestinians are represented in the municipal
Participated, yes.
participated in the municipal election. I mean, that's like a disaster. And people do say, by the way, I was in Germany recently for things, and people from Haifa, people do say that there is some sense in Haifa of there being, at least at the level of, you know, the civil society groups that meet with some element of equality, and there are discussions of that. I'm sure that happens in Jerusalem, I'm sure it happens in Tel Aviv, but none of it seems to impact on the structure.
Yeah, I think, Homi, I think you sort of, I was talking about, if you like, when I was talking about sharing and dividing and so on in the context of Jerusalem, of course, I was not taking into account the rest of the West Bank and even more the West Bank, Gaza kind of geographic situation. And of course, in the context of the present situation, you can't really talk about anything. I mean, there's nothing really to discuss seriously, positively, in a positive fashion. But what I was trying to say was that in a better kind of situation, in a better kind of climate, it is still possible to address the different issues that we have. It is mathematically possible to address the different issues that we have, whether it's in the West Bank or Gaza or Jerusalem. The problem is not that it is in itself, logically, if you like, a puzzle that cannot be solved. It is something that is political, and that is the problem with it. And it is politically poses. It is what poses a problem politically, but not logically, I think. So if the climate is changed, and that is possible, and what makes it possible is what you just said, that if you go beyond the surface a little bit, if you look at society, if you look at individuals, and so on, you will find that actually people, at the end of the day, are human beings, and very often at different levels interact with one another as equals and as human beings. It is only when they take on the, they put on the cloak of politics in one situation or another, that then there is a different dynamic. But underneath, I think, there are many cases, I believe, of people really believing that they are equal to the other side. I can't think of examples now, but
Oh, well, sorry if I might say so, that is.
But I'll give you an
a real
example.
problem.
I'll give you an example. So one good example, I think, is this: a youth orchestra of Israeli and Palestinians, and which gave me once the idea of writing something at a talk. And this was a talk. This was the context was something called sound and identity, or space and identity. And I wasn't sure what to say in this context. That's the conference I was invited to speak or give a talk at. And I was sitting with Lucy, with my wife, at a place where there was a youth orchestra, Israelis and Palestinians. They were about 14, 15, 16 years old. And they were practicing singing together. And they were singing. And they sang a beautiful song. You can actually Google it. They sang a beautiful song called "I Want to Make This Your Home." I want to make this your home. Now, this is an Israeli and a Palestinian, not just, there were about 10 of them. And I liked the title, that "I Want to Make This Home." I liked it being sung by the Israeli, addressed, as I imagined, to the Palestinian, and I liked it being sung by the Palestinian, as I imagined it being sung to the Israeli. And they were singing it in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in English. And I said to myself, you know, this is great. This is a new sound, and this is a sound that is creating a new space of identity, an identity of sharing. And you know, I went home and I worked a lot about this, on this, and developed a whole sort of concept, and went very happily to give a talk, and actually brought brought together with me to that talk the orchestra, what you call him, the
Choir, but
not
was it a choir?
no, it was a choir. No, we showed it on because it was in Hawaii, the conference. I couldn't take him with me to Hawaii, but no, but he came, not the entire group, but it made me feel good. It still does, and I think you'll find many examples like this, which gives us hope, which gives one hope, gives me hope. It is saddening, yes, that it's taking us so long, that it's taking so much time. It is saddening, especially for me as a Palestinian, because as you probably know, the pressure on this side, on the Palestinian side, is far greater than it is on the Israeli side. We're sort of at the receiving end, if you like. We live in constant anxiety. We live in constant, I don't know myself even if I am sort of fully normal by now as a result of the pressures that we live under. But even so, my hope still exists, and I think we should all continue to hope. And I think if we all hope, then you know we all can do something.
Let me ask you one last question. Then I want to show the photographs, and I want you to
Yeah.
just respond to them.
Okay.
So you said a moment ago that if things change, and this is a very big question. I don't know what should change. Should it change within the Palestinians? Which parties there? Which governmental structure should change? This we can have a conversation about. But I want to put this issue, the whole issue, the Middle Eastern issue, in the more general context. In the context of Saudi Arabia, in the context of the United States, where, of course, from what you say, Trump is very happy trying to rethink a kind of a federation of Palestinians, and whereas here, you know, Mexicans are not allowed, children who's born, I mean, so I just consider that to be a hideous way of displacing what is on his doorstep. But then you have Turkey. You have the problems in Lebanon, where there are a number of Palestinians. But generally, this kind of what Hannah Arendt called tribal nationalism, nationalism where the leaders of the country set themselves up as saviors. I mean, Netanyahu does this the whole time with Trump's encouragement, that the enemy is not that they are the enemy, really they are the enemy, the majority is the real minority, and they need to recover everything that they've lost. So with that kind of world scenario, how is it specifically affecting the claims of the Palestinians? Now.
You ask a very hard question. I think, let me tell you, I mean, the Palestinians have actually been living in a state of chaos in the past 10 years, say, especially since the death of Arafat, I think, and with the lack of progress. And in particular, you know, in the past few days, you may have heard or not, I'm not sure, but there's been problems with the actual structure, the PLO structure, that we've had as a representative for many years. Now, but in the meantime, for some reason, and somehow or another, the Palestinians have actually been are managing to bring themselves together again. And so, for example, I was contacted at one point a few months ago by somebody who came and said, and 2 or 3 people, to me, look, something is wrong with the structure. These are academics, journalists, Palestinians, one living in Turkey, one living I don't know where, but they came and said, and one Israeli Palestinian. And we should get together and try and think again of what we should be doing. And so we started the whole movement, if you like, of Palestinians that come from the refugee camps in Syria, Palestinians that come from Europe, from the United States, Palestinians from Israel, from the West Bank, from Gaza. And, they started, there's this sort of social media now people use, and they've been trying, they've been coming together again. And it's amazing how people can come back and become one again. And maybe we are just one group among many, but I can see that sort of happening. So in spite of everything that's happened to us, in spite of the pressure, in spite of the defeats, in spite of the chaos, in spite of, the entire world led by Trump being, being against us, I don't know why or how, but people seem to be able to gather their strength together, reformulate their structures, their strategies, their ways of thinking. And so I'm not, I haven't, on the contrary, I think I'm very hopeful, Palestinian-wise, of a future in which we will be able to live dignified human lives in our homeland, and not hopefully at the expense of anyone else who will live with us in equality.
And economically, you think this is viable?
Yes, I think economically the entire region can change, and economically I think we can look forward to prosperity in the Arab world. There's no reason why not.
Thank you.
No mathematical reason why not.
Well, if politics is about mathematics, sorry, can we just have these photographs, please? Thank you. So I'd just like you to look at them. This book was launched just a couple of weeks ago, and it's about...
Is it very costly?
I can get your copy. But that's the cover, and these are all pictures taken from her window over a period of time.
Wow.
Which overlooks the, you know where it is, it overlooks the wall.
Yeah. So these
and you can see the way in which, because of the way the photographs have been taken, they have a kind of a vertical dimension. There's a layered dimension.
I can't see the...
Why don't you...
Can I... Oh, I see. So this is in the actual precinct.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought under the general term of sharing the city, these might be some moments of a certain kind of sharing you might want to talk about. Can we have the next, please?
No sharing here. Yeah.
Third one, please.
Can hardly tell who these people are, right? It's,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. That, by the way, is a reflection through the window. So it's been relocated from being out of sight to being placed above the wall.
Yeah. Well, we were discussing pictures, photographs earlier with my wife and daughter, and I think over breakfast. And now I want to try and remember what they were saying. But, when you have pictures of Jerusalem, one of the things is that one has to take into account is that you are supposed to think not only of what you see, but of what you do not see. So the picture has meaning insofar not only as what it shows you, but what it doesn't show you. And so often, very often, you will take pictures, say, of religious Jews in the old city, say, many of them, and you will see only that picture. And the idea there is that you're not just seeing them, you're not seeing the other side, you're not seeing the Arabs in the old city, or vice versa. Now, in the first photo, the photo shows the two sides together. So it's Michal's pleasant way of looking at life. I don't know about the rest. I mean, I like that picture too. I just hope, that this is the place where, something might happen that will be horrible, that will be a kind of explosive.
Yeah.
Yes, the actual precinct, I mean, this is the place where everything can just, blow apart. It's the place that can, it's the place that's actually under, it's what's contested. And, what's contested is not the place, it's the narrative, it's the history. It's the acceptance of each other. I don't know if you realize, but one of the things that people must be reminded, I think, is that when the Muslims came to that area, there was nothing. I mean, the Muslims did not come and destroy an existing temple, for instance, Jewish temple. They did not destroy anything. It was totally, and so 500 years later, they came and built something. It wasn't, and in many ways, they built it, in my own opinion, as a way of commemorating the existence, but this is not a very popular thing for me to say, the existence of the temple. In my opinion, this was the whole idea behind it, that this was an affirmation of a continuity of the Abrahamic religions. That's why it was built. It was not to deny the Jewish history, it was to reaffirm it, in many ways. And this is, again, what makes it sad, that now it's the point over which there is this contention of narratives. And it's where, things will be made or be broken here. It's the
flashpoint.
It's the flashpoint.
Let's move to some questions from
Yes.
the audience. Please.
What can we do, just responding to your, sorry.
Do introduce yourselves if you'd like to.
My name is Sophie Schnapper. I'm an Israeli. I'm a scholar and scientist and biomedical scientist, but involved in activism of pro-Israel, pro-peace organization J Street. But otherwise, a question: just what can we do such that such explosion will not happen?
Sari, can we take two or three
Yeah.
questions? There was somebody here, and then there was somebody there, and then the three here, and then we'll go.
And maybe people can answer questions as well as ask them, please.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I actually lived in Jerusalem this summer. I was at the Mormon University on Mount Scopus studying. So I was wondering about just the legislation that may be needed, or what your insight is on possible legislation needed to maybe invite those ideas of equity between the people, allowing similar rights of citizenship, especially in Jerusalem with the residency and everything. Just possibly what legislation's needed.
Yes, there, please.
Hi, my name is Ghazi. I am a master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. My question is, again, slightly similar, slightly linked to the picture that we have in front as well, is that when we talk about sharing a city, one of the most important things in Jerusalem that has to be shared would be the common religious grounds. And one example of religious places that are not being shared is Hebron, where the Mosque of Ibrahim has been forcefully divided between a Jewish quarter and a Muslim quarter. So I just wanted to get your view on how, if we do talk about sharing from an optimistic perspective, would we ever be able to share the religious sites that are present within Jerusalem?
Okay.
What can we do?
I'm not sure what can be done, actually. I think the most important thing is to maintain the faith in the ability to get there at the end. I mean, you know, things are so distressing and so disappointing, and so that you need to exercise even more effort to try and maintain faith in the possibility of reaching some kind of equitable solution. And I think that requires a lot of courage and a lot of commitment, a lot of hard work. And to sort of, you know, try, I'm not sure actually, I think there are many things that can be done at the level of human interactions. And even abroad, I mean, maybe to try and get more support for a solution. I think it's very important for Israelis or pro-Israelis and pro-Palestinians abroad to try and make peace between themselves, for instance. I remember in the past I was, you know, in the past I used to come out sometimes with an Israeli colleague to sort of garner support for a peaceful solution, and we'd find the audiences there abroad in the States or somewhere, Israeli, pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, needing to have peace be made among them or between them. So I think a lot has to be done here. I think there has to be encouragement for people. People have to encourage each other who want to make peace. They have to continue to encourage each other and give hope for one another. But I don't really know. I don't have any specific answers. With legislation, you know, we have a problem now with the nation-state law, which has made things even worse. And I hope, you know, sometime in the future it still can be changed. It needs a lot of work to have it changed. So it's not just one legislation. I think, you know, there's a whole dynamic there that needs to be changed. And with the Hebron, I think you're right. I think but the most important thing there is to somehow come to accept the narrative of the other. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but in the case of this particular place, there was Clinton came up with an idea. I don't know, you know, during the talks that were rejected at the time, in which he sort of asked Palestinians and Israelis to somehow think of dividing things up in their minds between what's above ground and what's below ground, what's in history and what's in existence. And it was a roundabout way of basically saying, look, you know, the Palestinians, the Muslims or whoever, have to accept Jewish history in this place. This has to be recognized. But likewise, the Jewish people or the Israelis have to accept now the status quo in this place. It's a kind of exchange of ideas. But I don't really know. I'm not very sure, but maybe we need another messenger from God who will come and tell us.
We thought you were going to be that messenger. You're not telling us.
Well, you know, I did think, yes, I put in an application, but but look, I mean, you know, because I mean, it just doesn't make any sense for those religions, and you know, not just I mean, Jerusalem in particular is just as important for Muslims, Christians, as well as Jews, and they all revolve around the same places. And it's a question of maybe we have to go back to the idea of the idea and try to sort of somehow work on the idea of religion in the context of of those people. And maybe when we do that, it's possible then to somehow be open to other people, yeah. I mean, religions can be terrible, as you know. And you know, it's in my case, for instance, I feel in particular that yeah. Sorry.
Yep, right there.
Yeah,
up there,
so
and then
this may be coming from a little bit of a dark side.
Where's the dark side? Oh, there, Melissa. Yes,
I'm the dark side.
Melissa is the dark side.
Just because, given the constellation of world leaders we have right now, anything bad can happen, and does. From a different perspective, 2 questions. What's the worst thing that can happen? What would be the worst move that would destroy any possibility of peace? And what would be, on the not dark side, what would be a situation where the Palestinians and the Israelis had to work together just to survive? So what can you imagine bringing them together? If like a crisis, climate change, I don't know, something. And then what could you imagine is the worst thing that could happen that, for instance, Trump and Netanyahu could do, and what the other guy, the Saudi?
I don't think Trump and Netanyahu can do things, I mean, as such, but what can happen, the worst thing, is a series of tragic accidents or incidents, one leading to the other, and ending up with a major, major effort to expel Palestinians. So sort of one act leading to another, becoming more explosive and leading to eviction, mass eviction of people. And that would be a terrible thing, I think, a worse thing, for a long period of time. What can happen is if, for the Palestinians and the Israelis get together, if suddenly we see the Netanyahu attended by a lot of right-wing religious leaders hugging up Hamas with leaders and Muslim religious extremist leaders. I think if that happens and people see that, I think people will come together again.
sorry, there's this gentleman in green. Could you? Oh yeah, all right, fine. Could you just distribute the mic as you see people? I don't want to conduct this.
Hi, my name is Robin. I wanted to thank you for coming today. It's wonderful to hear you. And I wanted to just address this woman's question, what can we do? I think the first thing, that was a great question. I always think of that myself. But I think the first thing everybody has to do is vote, whether it's here or in Israel. We've all got to vote and make our legal representatives accountable for what we think is right. But also, I wanted to say that we can support all the arts. We see Mohammed Asaf has been out there creating a lot of national pride. We've had the recent Palestinian Film Festival in Boston, which was magnificent and very rich representation of the arts. Boston has a wonderful Palestinian comedian who communicates with humor, love, and tremendous national pride. I can't think of his name right now, but do you remember his name? I can't remember his name. And we have the Center of Arabic Culture, which often has social events that celebrates and promotes understanding. And so I just wanted to say participating and asking ourselves what can we do is really important. And
If you can't remember his name, can you remember one of his jokes?
not right now, I'm too nervous.
Gentleman in the green.
We don't know what the Trump plan is because he hasn't presented it yet. However, he did make the startling statement that the negotiations will be easier because he's taken Jerusalem off the table, which is really incomprehensible. Rumors of the plan, though, suggest that it's some kind of a rump state with Abu Dis as its nominal capital. And Israel, of course, continues to refer to Jerusalem as its undivided capital. So I'm wondering whether this is really a red line, whether the protests in Gaza are the beginnings of a fourth intifada, and whether Jerusalem really is, just to be very specific, non-negotiable.
Jerusalem is non-negotiable for us. We have to have equal rights in it. It is non-negotiable.
You expect that fourth intifada is on its way?
Gaza is under such pressure. Gaza is under such pressure. People living in such poverty. They're living in such distress that even if it explodes, it will, simply implode. And this is what's happening with it. And Gaza has to be addressed at the humanitarian level, and it needs emergency assistance. It needs both Israel as well as the Palestinian Authority to open up, to facilitate. Egypt, but the immediate neighbors and parties that are responsible are both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority has to look after the people in Gaza, and Israel has to enable the PA to look after the people in Gaza. But no, I don't think there's an intifada coming, although there's a weekly, as you know, there's a weekly march every Friday. Yesterday, 3 kids, 12 years old, were killed. Apparently they thought they were, but I mean, they were putting out things for catching birds, like 12-year-olds do. It's a distressful situation in Gaza.
I've long thought that a primary barrier to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were the internal conflicts among Israelis on the one hand and among Palestinians on the other, which make the leadership challenges extremely difficult. What hope do you see for progress with respect to the internal conflicts among Palestinians? Because some wonder whether there's going to be 1 or 2 Palestinian states. I mean, given the rather profound division that has at times led to almost a civil war among Palestinians.
With still more to come, probably, in the near future. We didn't go into that, but yes, I mean, we as Palestinians have a major crisis at the moment in our leadership as a result of failure in the peace process on the one hand and internal failures on the other hand. In addition to the major, differences between Hamas and Fatah and so on. So we have a major problem, and we have to deal with it. So
And the Israelis, of course, do too.
the Israelis have a problem, I think, But so what's the question?
Well, the question is,
What's it? For what? 42.
Hi, my name is Tal Al-Jabri. I'm a Palestinian diaspora. I study at HKS. I thought it was really interesting, the example that you brought up about the orchestra and about forging a new identity. And obviously, being a Palestinian diaspora, as I'm sure it is for Palestinians who live in the Palestinian territories, it's such a central theme in our life. And so I was wondering, in forging that new identity, what that would look like, and if you could elaborate on that. And thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for coming. But how come you're a diaspora person if you're a Jabari? I don't understand. Yes, go ahead.
So my dad is actually Syrian, my mom's Palestinian, but I first and foremost identify as Palestinian, but that's a different story.
Okay. Well, I think that Homi will tell us about identities and forging identities better than I can, but
Not tonight.
But I think you can start with, you know, it's hard when you, it's easier when you're talking, say, to a friend, and you can forge a kind of identity between the two of you. And, you know, you can be anything and they can be anything. And, you know, the bigger the circle, again, this is reverting to another piece of wisdom my wife was telling us this morning. The larger the circle of identity, the more difficult it is to merge or to, so you have to start small and work upwards. And I think if you form a group, a small group, it can influence. It can have ripple effects, perhaps. But then, as Robin was saying earlier, I think at the end you have to be effective politically by actually becoming a politician, at least by voting. I mean, you have to vote. But you can do far more than voting. You can be more active in creating this kind of community. There are many communities, Israeli-Palestinian communities, by the way, that, examples that we have that can be built upon. By the way, Robin, who spoke before you, is married to, I just discovered, someone who's a distant cousin. He's a distant cousin, who was born in Syria too. There you are. Yeah.
Could I ask Lucy Nusseibeh to speak? Because clearly you have been inspiring Sari with these various ideas all day. From photographs in the morning, circles of identification in the afternoon. So could you tell, you have your own NGO, and could you add to this discussion by answering the good Leninist question, what is to be done?
Take a step back.
I don't think I could answer the question at all, but thank you very much for the
What should not be done?
invitation. I think I would just add to what others have been saying, the importance of really reaching across to the humanity of other people. That part of what seems to be going on is this aim at polarizing, at allowing us to dehumanize other people, and that it's important to resist this. And it's important to resist the kind of despair and discouragement that is thrown at us, that the kind of resilience that Sari actually exemplifies and was insisting on, I think, earlier. This is really incredibly important, not just in the Israeli-Palestinian context, I think, but in a more global context. As we look around us, you know, we have to reach out and say, no, this is not who we are, and this is not how we will accept seeing other people. We are insisting on engaging with others as equal human beings with total reciprocal respect, something like this.
Lucy, can I ask you whether these ideas of some kind of convergence that you were talking about that happened at different levels, are there any in Jerusalem? Are there any state institutions or are there national institutions that give you hope? For instance, in India, we do have the Supreme Court. And give or take, we have hope in the Supreme Court that minorities, social justice issues will be, not always, but quite often, welcomed and hospitably dealt with. Are there any institutions for both of you, in the Israel-Palestinian confluence that give you hope for the future or for the present?
I think there used to be. I can't think of any at the moment that...
There's an interesting case recently of...
He's better than...
No, but I was going to say there's an interesting case of Because, you would say the Supreme Court, for instance. But in Israel in particular, that has been, influenced by the politics, and so not as reliable as it was. But most recently, for instance, there was this case of the American Palestinian student who was coming in to study at the Hebrew University, and she was prevented from doing so to begin with. And actually, one of the things that made her case stronger, that eventually made a difference, was the fact that the Hebrew University itself and the academics there, or a sufficient number of them, stood up for her and, made a whole thing. And so finally she's now at the Hebrew University studying. Roger.
Peter Gordon. Yeah, we don't need mics here.
The case you just raised is very interesting to me personally. That young woman was interested in pursuing study in international human rights at the university, which makes the denial of her entry all the more poignant. But as I understand it, one of the facts that counted in her favor is that although at an earlier point in her studies as a student in the United States, she had been a proponent of the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, she had later renounced that stance, and that this counted in her favor. This is, I'm perhaps putting you on the spot, but at least among diaspora Jews who oppose current Israeli policy, the BDS movement is usually seen as one of the most divisive factors. Friends of mine like Nev Gordon, no relation apparently, who support it are ostracized by certain portions of the Jewish community. And her case in particular was a very interesting one, where her renunciation of that tactic seems to have played a role in her admission. And I'm curious, from your perspective on the Palestinian side, whether BDS seems to have any constructive role to play, or whether it's seen as largely irrelevant to political outcomes.
So this is putting me on the spot. It's a very difficult question. Look, let me start somewhere else on BDS, because normally when people talk, the Palestinians talk about BDS, they not only are thinking of Americans or Europeans, they're thinking of Palestinians. And they're saying basically that in Palestine itself, we, the Palestinians, should boycott counterparts, Israelis. So what does that mean? It means basically boycotting everything, from the economic to the trade to the commerce to this, to this, to this, to this, right up to the negotiation level. Now, so this is entirely, this is something that is, I think, as a thing, entirely separate from the call for Europeans or Americans to boycott Israel, right? And, I would argue very strongly, personally, that at the level of the Palestinians, the thrust, the force shouldn't be to boycott, but to do the opposite, to engage, because that is the way to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians closer to one another. Now, concerning the outside, now I think it varies. The Jewish, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, I think this is a situation that has to be solved within the Jewish community. But I'll tell you, as far as the non-Jewish community is concerned, because I've had, like in the past, I've had situations where someone who was invited to, more than once, someone was invited to Israel to participate in a talk at the Hebrew University or Tel Aviv or somewhere, would write to me and say, look, I've been invited, I'm worried about this BDS, what do you think? And can I come and give a talk at your university somehow to sort of balance this? And You know, my reaction would have been, was in fact, on more than one occasion, that, you know, they should make up their own minds what they wanted to do. But in any case, if they decided to come and, you know, participate in whatever, then, you know, they would be welcome to come and give a talk at our place, but not to use the fact that they are coming to give a talk at our university as a kind of justification to go and talk over there. But they have to go through the ethical, if you like, management processing themselves. They have to decide what best fits their moral bearings. Now, you know, has it been useful? In many ways, the campaign for BDS in American campuses in Europe has been useful in the sense it's raised awareness in a way that this was not, did not happen before concerning the Palestinian plight. So, you know, there is that part of it which you can say is positive. On the other hand, it's also created more friction, whether within the Jewish community or between the pros, you know, the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestinian groups. And you see, like, if you're thinking like me, then you're thinking, you know, you want to make, it's the point I made earlier, you want to make the pro-Israels and the pro-Palestinians actually to make peace between one another. That's what you want to do. And you don't want to create the friction. And, you know, you need that peace abroad in order to support the peace within. So, you know, how do you solve this puzzle? You know, you should go to the United Nations and ask for intervention to get Israelis, pro-Israelis and pro-Palestinians to get together. You know, because the conflict outside actually only serves to create more conflict inside.
Thanks. Talking about boycotts and academic boycotts that you mentioned, as a former president of the Al-Quds University, how do you see the boycott? If I understood well, Palestinian universities boycott or are not allowed to collaborate with Israeli universities. So how do you see this? Would you favor collaboration of Palestinian universities?
I do, is the simple question answer. I mean, I do, in fact, but my position has been very unpopular in the past with regard. At first, as you say, the Council for Education, the Palestinian Council for Education, took a position, this was even after Oslo, to not to have any, to prevent any connections between Israeli and Palestinian universities. I was member of the Council for Education, and I said to the council that I will not abide by this decision, and we are an independent institution. You want to go this way, fine, but you know, my way is different. And we, in fact, did go on and institute relations with Israeli counterparts all the way up to 2000, I think, and 14 was it, or whenever it was that Israel invaded Gaza the second time, and 9 the first time. And at that point, you know, it became very hard. And I convened a meeting with all the Palestinian academics at my university who were engaged in projects with Israeli counterparts, and I asked them how they felt. And it was a very emotional point, emotional period at that time. And after a lot of discussion, the majority decision was, you know, should suspend our relations with Israeli counterparts, but we should look again at this after a period of time. But we should not stop anything that's ongoing at the moment. So there was that. And after I left the administration, I think people at the university have been less enthusiastic about. But as I was saying earlier, I mean, in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian relations, you know, there are many things you can boycott. And I think the last one you want to boycott is, in fact, academic cooperation. I mean, you can start with the mafia on both sides and stop them, you know, from cooperating. And the underworld, there's a lot of cooperation. and and you can go on a whole
Adelson.
list.
Adelson.
Adelson, yeah. But academics, I think, should be able to, and actually, we stand to benefit the Palestinians from this cooperation.
Please. Sorry, you've been waiting for a long time. I apologize.
Thank you. I have a question about the whole concept of sharing. And I wonder how it works when one side comes to the table holding all of the cards, or all of the oranges, or all of the cakes.
One orange.
And the other side doesn't have it. So does the concept of sharing work there, or is it more a matter of giving and receiving? And if the latter, then to what extent does the giver really want to give? And to what extent does the recipient really want to receive? So I have a little bit of doubt about this notion of sharing, although I believe in it firmly myself.
Well, as Homi was saying earlier, I think one of the things you have to do when you come to the table is to change who you're sitting in front of. So, of course, I think there's Homi's point that, of course, a negotiator, or the party that is negotiating with you has to be somehow worked in order to begin to see you differently. And I think once they do that, then it's not a matter, it ceases to be a matter of giving as a kind of, it becomes a matter of perhaps a moral imperative, or perhaps even a need. In the case of the Israelis and the Palestinians, I'll tell you something that struck me some time ago when I was younger, that Shimon Peres said, that I used very often. At one stage, Shimon Peres was actually trying to get, he was talking about the need to make peace with the Palestinians. This was in the 80s. It was in the mid-80s, so it was before anything. And he was making this statement to Israelis, in his own backyard, so to speak. And he said something like this. He said, he was telling them, we have to make an exchange with the Palestinians because it is true that we, the Israelis, hold the present, but the Palestinians hold the future. And the exchange we have to make is for us to give them a part of the present so that they can give us a part of the future. This is the real exchange. And so we, the Palestinians, actually are not weak at the negotiating table. Yes, we don't have guns, or we don't have enough of them. We don't have rockets. We don't have all of that. But don't be mistaken. We are very strong. We are very strong.
So there's a question here, and then there's a question there. You want a question. That's the last question. So 1, 2, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the language and the rhetoric of oranges and their sharing, as well as the language of sharing in the title of the conversation, and the rhetoric, the attendant rhetoric of giving and exchange, all of that reminds me of the kind of language that is used in a considerable chunk of the academic literature on Israel-Palestine, which really uses the language of settler colonialism as the basis, as the primary basis for making sense of what sharing is like. And I take the last sentiment to be attendant to the ways in which a straightforward metaphor of sharing might not be as attendant to the political imbalances that are historically mediated and sedimented. So my question is really about, in what ways can we have the historical process and the ongoing, indeed, historical process of settler colonialism be central to a conversation about going forward? And one way in which I've been struggling with this is precisely through the coalitions that have been forming recently between Jews and Palestinians, and indeed non-Jews and non-Palestinians, around a settler colonial perspective that recognizes the extant ways in which religion and culture play a role, but also points to their contingency. And so you can have an anti-Zionist Jew and an anti-Zionist Palestinian and an anti-Zionist humanist working together for a way of life, a cohabitation that recognizes the humanity of everyone there in ways perhaps that fall beyond the rhetoric of sharing. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the question of language and the framework that we've been using in making sense of the issue.
Well, I mean, don't forget, when we use the term sharing in this context, we're thinking in terms of the existing parameters, political parameters, which are to do with having to try and still make out a case for some kind of resolution between the Israelis and the Palestinians on the basis of two states, basically. All right? And, you know, if you cannot do that, we're still thinking in the context of the same parameters. We're thinking, you know, if that's not possible, then how else, within, again, the existing circumstances, can we, in any case, bring about some kind of an equitable kind of living condition for both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, what you're saying, in fact, you know, pushes a bit further. What you're doing is basically telling us we should, you know, reconsider the parameters. And, you know, the parameters that are being used in the modern context or in the existing context do not actually work. And you may be right. And actually, it's something that is, you know, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, that it's something that does occur to one that maybe, for instance, Zionism as such, even Palestinian nationalism as such, are just as they are and as they've become, are things that cannot of themselves resolve into something that, you know, as you call humanitarian state of peace between people. Well, I think we have to work slowly. I mean, you know, I'm prepared to look at, you know, in my case, at my age, I'm prepared to look at every way people offer you to push forward and towards peace. And on a peace that will be equitable, that will offer dignity and respect for different people, different individuals belonging to different backgrounds. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter very much how you get there, or what sort of theoretic construct you use in order to get there. In my case, say, as a person living in Jerusalem, all I need is to finally find peace at home. Now, you know, whether through this theoretic construct or that, at the end of the day, it's secondary for me. But you're right. I mean, I think the language we use is very much stuck to a certain framework of politics that we are today following.
But peace with dignity, peace with equality. So that's where all the rubs come in. If you're willing to accept, you know, some kind of ad hocery, then, you know, then you can get a kind of peace, but it's not with dignity and equality, which is your demand. Yes, the final question, please.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is kind of going off of what Abdullah has just said. We've talked so much about understanding and reaching across for that understanding, but I haven't heard the word responsibility or accountability be used so much. And I feel like the root of this is really within Israeli society to overcome a great deal of denial of accountability in the region. And we're talking a lot about recognizing each other as human beings, and the Israeli military's behavior on the Gaza Strip is not recognition of Palestinians as human beings. And so I wonder, just to end, if you have any, to my mind, the only kind of route, at least, might be within local communities in Israel to begin to have these conversations, to begin to start even talking about the idea of settler colonialism, which is not discussed widespread in the Israeli youth. And one idea that's applicable perhaps is the idea of truth commissions, which has been used in South Africa. And I wonder if you know of any or are involved in any or promote any discussion groups among young people, among education groups in Palestinian communities, or if you know of any within Israeli communities that adopt these kind of values of recognition that might overcome some of this denial and blindness on the part of Israelis.
Well, your question is very difficult to answer. I mean, I don't really know such groups. I think that, the problem is to have such groups. I mean, the problem is that people, as you say, are in denial of their responsibility. If you think about Israel as the soldiers that are shooting at the people in Gaza, or if you think of Israel as the occupation, or Israel as the colonial movement, or as the displacement movement of the Palestinians. And if on the Israeli side you think of the Palestinians as the terrorists and as I don't know what and what and what, it's very hard to get either side to think in terms of reconsidering their self-view, their self-appreciation. And so it's sort of going to take time to get there to the point where you can start, for instance, like commissions that will look into, that will accept responsibility on the part of their entire group. I think it will take a long time. I don't know of any that exist today. I mean, there are Israeli groups, like for instance the soldiers and so on, and who will wonderful stories. I mean, there's I was reading something by David Schulman recently, who's at the Hebrew University. Something even more interesting by a woman called Hillerman, I think, Dr. Hillerman. She produced her book in Hebrew about 2 years ago, but now it's coming out in English, I think Chicago Press. And I mean, you read her and you see that she actually, I mean, she's accompanied Palestinian workers, she's accompanied Palestinian prisoners, she's gone to jail, she's been in the middle of Gaza, in the middle of, and in each and every corner she is describing exactly how she sees the underdog, the Palestinian being treated in that kind of situation. And this kind of testimony, I think, is something very important, not only because it tells about the Palestinians, I think because, as I see it, it tells also about herself. It tells about the existence of this human spirit in the midst of the Israeli, in this case, living in West Jerusalem. So you just have to have more of this. Sometime further on in the future, maybe you will have a commission of human rights and we'll be able to, but we're still a long way from there.
Peter, could you just announce the Sari's next talk, please?
Yeah, I had a technical failure earlier, but I hope many of you know that Professor Nusseibeh will be giving a talk this Thursday as well, which I suppose the title relates in some ways to what you were describing, the hopeful image of a possible future. But this will address a more academic and philosophical theme. Are possible facts real? An Abyssinian vignette. And this will be this Thursday from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Tsai Auditorium, which is CGIS South. So I hope you'll all come to hear Professor.
But it's not about politics, and it may be sort of very boring for a lot of you. And
I want to thank Sari, because in fact what you've made us aware of in this both despairing and at the same time committed conversation. Isn't there a Palestinian word called sumud or something?
Yes, yes.
Sumud?
Sumud.
We're here, I'm going to stay, I'm resilient, sumud, with that sentiment. I think many of us in other parts of the world have to take on that same attitude. We live in a very, very divided, ferociously uncaring situation now. And you see it in India, you see it, of course, in Turkey, in this country, where there is plenty in some areas. You see it at every level, and of course, the most ludicrous identification of those who are out of work with an economic fraudster who is supposed to be the savior or the sign of the future just makes you baffled. So that the things we don't understand about the Middle East and about that region, there are many things we don't understand here, and I hope in our mutual vulnerability we will find both knowledge and strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much.